Hey, welcome to this programming user interface lecture. Today we're going to talk about reactive JavaScript libraries. And so we looked at JavaScript libraries in the last lecture, and that focused on kind of bringing in additional functionality into your program or project by using someone else's library that is then able to add something new to your project by introducing like a new API or some sort of new kind of way of interacting with the library. And so what we are going to look at today is basically another JavaScript library that brings in more functionality, but that's more focused on more of like a framework of developing applications. So instead of like jQuery, which we looked at last week, which is just very specifically looking at like interacting with the DOM and how do you do that through the jQuery interface and API, we're going to be looking at these frameworks, which basically kind of define how to do an entire application or a single page application using this library or this framework. And so there's a number of these frameworks that you could use that have been coming out over the number of years. Some of them include Angular, things like React.js, and then also Vue.js. And there's also one Svelte.js, which is a little bit newer. And so we're going to try some exercises with Vue.js just because it's a little bit, I think, more straightforward and easier to use. But we're going to talk about a little bit about the differences between what we've been doing, kind of manipulating the DOM, and then what do these new frameworks bring to the process that might be useful. So we're going to make a new glitch here, and we're going to make just a static hello world. And so just kind of like going through the idea of what we did last, or what we've been doing with DOM and DOM manipulation has been focused on kind of just building elements, changing elements, and kind of changing the CSS style of elements, etc. Right? And so what these frameworks bring to our projects or to our code is that it provides a way to kind of reactively respond to changes in data. And so if you think about the way we've been doing stuff, we've usually had some like data work going on that's changing stuff, and then we need to go and take the results of those changes and update the DOM with new stuff. For example, in our city bike example, we had a little process that checked the city bike API, and then we had another process that took that data and built a new interface for it. And so with these, at the most kind of like simplest level, there's a huge, there's lots of avenues to these libraries and different things they can do. But the simplest idea is that these provide a way to reactively work with data and update the interface without you having to go through all that boilerplate of manually changing stuff and updating things. So at its simplest level, it's just a much easier way to update your DOM based on changes in your data. So for example, here is a basic static site that we're going to add some JavaScript to. So say we were making something very simple, like in the API example, we were doing stuff with City Bike API, but the same idea kind of holds true if you just have some data that you want to manipulate the interface with later, right? So let's say we have a variable here. Let's just make like a simple counter interface, right? You press a button and the counter goes up, right? So we'll say counter equals 0. So now we have a number, and then we're gonna have a place to display that data in our page. So we'll make a new div, and we'll call that ID equals counter display, and then the counter will go in there. And so in our script we'd have something like we'd have to document get element by ID, and then counter display, and then we could set the inner HTML to counter, right? So if we looked at this, we'd see that it's 0, right? That's what we defined it to. And so if we wanted to add a button, right, that says add one, we have to give this ID to, right? We'll say ID equals button add. Then we have to add an event listener to this, right? So we'll say document, or we'll say button var button equals document get element by ID, and then we can say okay, well, we'll add a button.add event listener, And we'll listen for the click. And then when that happens, we'll do the function. And then we'll say, okay, counter equals counter plus 1, right? And so if we go back to our page and we click on this, nothing's happening, right? Nothing changes. But if we console log this to the counter, and we looked at the console as we were doing that, we'd see it is increasing, right? The numbers are going up. And so the problem is that it's not updating the interface, right? So the data is changing behind the scenes, but the interface is not changing. And so if we wanted to make this work really in our example, we'd have to say, okay, add the counter and then make sure you update the interface with a new another time with the new value of the counter. So now if we did this again, we'd see that it would go up, right, as we clicked. So that seems pretty straightforward, right? And this is how it works with JavaScript. That's just how it is. You have to do your data stuff and you have to make sure you update the interface. And so this doesn't seem terribly terrible, in this with just this one variable. But imagine if you're building a very complex interface, a shopping site, a museum webpage, anything, right? You're going to have lots of data and changing the interface. And so the idea of these reactive libraries and frameworks basically handle all of this kind of boilerplate problem for you. So you define a variable, it watches that variable, and then wherever you use that variable in your code, in your HTML, it updates that automatically. And that's just kind of like the simplest kind of version of this. So let's try to see what this would look like in one of these reactive frameworks. So some of these frameworks, they are very kind of like strict about how they are initialized, and you have to have this whole build chain that builds the application from scratch, and or builds the application from code, and it compiles it and generates this new code that you then view in the browser. And so there's things like Angular, which is kind of one of the older ones, one of these frameworks that has a specific syntax. React is kind of a very popular one, right? This is very common. It is built, introduced by Facebook, and it has this JSX kind of component to it, where the HTML is kind of in the JavaScript file, and you usually have to have this like very kind of like big build chain to get the application even started. And then the one we're going to use today is Vue.js, which is nice because you can do that same idea of have this big build chain where you kind of have this big project from the start and it compiles. But you can also just kind of like drop the library into the page like we've been doing for other libraries, and then you can start using it immediately. So we're going to use Vue.js just to kind of get a sense of what's possible, right? And so of course the first thing we need to do is include the library, and so they give us a link to include it. And so we will add that to our header. So now it's included in the page. And then basically you have to have this kind of boilerplate setup in your JavaScript that then is kind of initializes the framework, and then you can go from there. And so basically if you have this is the kind of boilerplate that we're going to be using. And so let's get rid of our old code, or we'll just comment it out. Or we'll get rid of it. We don't need it. We're going to get rid of this button, and we're going to get rid of the div. And so we're going to have a new script here in the body of the text of the page. And that's going to have our template or initialization. And so this goes back to the same idea that we were talking about with other libraries, is just you have to read the documentation and understand how you're supposed to use that library to get started. There's really no inherent knowledge. You would know that this is how you get started with this library. You just have to read the documentation and kind of understand what they're saying. And so basically they're saying, okay, if you want to start off a new kind of Vue.js app or framework, you have to define these parameters, at least these parameters, and then it should work. And so basically you're defining the element that it's going to live in, so where in the page it's going to live in. So it says it's going to live in the # app, so that means you have to have some element that is that ID, right? So we'll make a div, and that will give it the ID app. And then it has this data. And so this data is like reactive, and it keeps track of what this data is. And so in this case, it has a message, and it's a string. It says hello Vue. And so the other component you have is these, basically this template. It's like a HTML template, which we've done earlier in the course, basically kind of inserting data into the HTML. And so this is similar to Angular, but it's different from React, where the templates are actually in the JavaScript file. And so you have these double curly brackets here, which define where the data should go in, right? And so message here is one of the variables that we define in our data object. So the data, whatever messages in the data will appear here. And so that's another thing with these frameworks is like, this is not standardized HTML, right? This is not standardized anything. This is just the way that they want it to work. And we'll see that there's other things like that too. And so basically what the library does is that initializes it. It basically takes this div named app and processes it and goes through it and looks for things like this, right? And replaces it with the data. And it does this constantly when data changes. So when the message changes, you don't have to go say, oh, inner HTML equals this. It just does it automatically for you. So let's see if it worked. All right, so it worked, right? So when I refresh, it just automatically runs, so we see it appear. And so what we can do is modify this data, right? And the framework also makes this very easy, but again, it's like not standardized, right? You don't go to WC and see how you update the DOM. It's like they have their own notation, their own style. And it's very similar to like jQuery, right? You don't know how it works until you go and read the documentation on how you're supposed to update something with jQuery. And so what we can do is add a button here. And basically we can give it an ID if we wanted to. So we'll just call add to message. And so another shorthand in Vue is this click method. So you can just say @click, and inside of here you just tell it what function you want it to do when you when you invoke that event. So I'll say add to message, right? You actually don't even need an ID in this because we're not going to be selecting it. So let's just get rid of that. So we just have basically this weird kind of new thing. This is not standardized HTML, right? And another thing that I just messed up here is that this all has to be inside the div. So everything needs to be inside of this kind of one div. That's where everything lives, because it's not parsing the whole page, it's just parsing that one div. So you have to make sure it's split up. So let's make this a little bit nicer. We'll have one div here, and we'll put our message in there. Then we'll have another div here, and we'll put our button in there. And so we define this thing saying, okay, when you click on it, right, this is the notation that Vue has defined that how you want to invoke an event click. And so it's going to look for a function called add to message in your methods definition. And so this is just another object, but instead of values, it has these functions defined inside of it, or these methods defined inside of it. And so we can just say add to message, and it's a function, and do something in there. And so we haven't really talked about object-oriented programming and stuff like that, but there's this reserved word for basically in JavaScript this that refers to the context of the things happening. And in this case, when you say this, you're referring to the entire Vue app, this entire Vue application. And so what you can say is this, and then the thing, the piece of data that you want to modify, and say change it to something else. So let's change it to test if we click on this. So if we go back here and we click on this button, oh, there's no text in the button. So we'll add some text to it. Say click me. So if we go to the rendering of it, right, and we click on this, we didn't do anything without manipulating the DOM, right? We didn't change any inner HTML, any inner text, anything like that. We didn't even have to select anything. we just change the value inside of our methods, right? We just change the value of this message to something different, right? And so of course you can define new stuff, right? Let's have a counter equals 0. And then we could say, okay, when you click on that, we'll say this counter plus plus. And that's basically JavaScript shorthand for equals this counter plus 1, right? Same thing, same difference. All right, so now when we come in here and we clicked on this, it would just, oh, we didn't update the template though, right? So the template has to change from displaying the message to the variable we want, which is counter, right? So we'll display the message and the counter. All right. Right, and so it seems kind of simple, right? You're like, well, I understand the other way. Why would I want to do it this way? But if you can imagine that you might have a very complicated application with many, dozens of values and all sorts of events and all sorts of things going on that you might want to kind of react to, right? And have a something happen to your interface when the data changes. And so this is kind of makes it super simple to do that, right? And the difference is, right, if you look at the source code for this page, right, if you said view source, right, this is the source code, right? It's not really there, right? JavaScript is handling all of this interpretation of it. So of course it is dependent on JavaScript working, right, and the person having JavaScript. That's usually the case nowadays. So you can do all sorts of stuff, anything you can do that we've done with vanilla JavaScript, manipulating the DOM, or jQuery, you can do with this, something like Vue. Add any kind of listener, event listener you want to do with page up, page down, key press, key up, key down, clicking, all sorts of stuff like that. Another thing is interesting, you can start controlling the flow of the program and stuff like that. So for example, say we didn't want a div to be displayed unless the counter was greater than a certain number, right? So you could actually define that here and say, okay, div, and now you have to use a special Vue vernacular that they define. So you say v-if, and inside of this v-if, these double quotations, you put basically the JavaScript test. If you were running an if statement, this is the stuff that would go inside of the parentheses, and you test whatever you want to test. So you'd say, okay, inside of here, message has to be greater than 10. And inside of here is just basic HTML, whatever you want. Right? So if we looked at this now, it's going to hit this if statement and test this. It knows what message is. Oh, we don't want message, though. We want counter, right? Sorry. So it knows what message is, it knows what counter is, and it knows the counter is 0 to start with, right? So it doesn't show up. But as I'm clicking, right, it's increasing it, and every time the data changes, it evaluates that if statement again and again and again. And so as soon as I click to 11, it's going to show up, right? And so that, again, it seems very kind of simple in these rudimentary examples, but if you think about, if you kind of extrapolate that further down the line, it kind of gets really powerful with stuff you can do, right? Another thing you can do is bind different attributes, right? So you can change the style and the class, for example. So you can bind those to data. Let's do another thing. So say you had let's say you had a list of things. We'll just call it list of things, and this will be an empty array. And so let's say every time you click on this button, it's going to add one to the counter. And we'll also add it to the list of things. So we'll call this a list of numbers instead. And so we'll say, okay, that list of numbers, push, that's how you add something to an array in JavaScript, right? And we're just going to add in that counter. So every time we add, it's going to add this to the list of numbers. And so, we could always console log it to make sure it's working. And so that's always good to do. So let's just console log it for now and see what it does every time we click it. Right, so there is our list, or our array, a list of numbers, or array of numbers. And what we can do with a array is you can actually loop over it in Vue.js and in any reactive thing. So you could have a let's have an unordered list, right? And then we're going to have a list element, and we're going to say v4, and we're going to say so for number in list of numbers, and then in here we're going to say the number, the num or num, right? So this is the variable that we defined. It's an array, and then this is kind of like, remember when we do like a for each, there's like this little variable that represents that piece of the array for each iteration. And so in this case, we're going to say, okay, pass that into the text. So what this is going to do is it's going to duplicate this element the number of times that there are in that array. And so if we click on this, we see that as we click, it grows, right? And so if we inspected this, we would see that it is basically adding a new list element every time there's a new element added to the data in the list of numbers, right? So it's adding a new number, so it adds it to the array, and then Vue sees that the array has been increased, and it does all this automatic updating for you. And again, I keep saying this, but it's very kind of simplistic from this point of view. But when you think about the possibilities, it becomes very interesting as far as being able to make these kind of single page applications that do lots of stuff and is very very reactive to your data. And so of course this is very simple as far as what we've defined, but you can go, once this makes sense, you can kind of go further and start thinking about the other aspects of Vue that include more kind of complicated conditions of what you think would be in a application, right? So talk about event handling, talk about routing. So if you have multiple pages in your single page application, how do you switch between them? All sorts of stuff. How do you interact with APIs, and how do you do stuff with the data? And then of course, one of the big things with these reactive things is the idea of state. And so with these reactive frameworks, you can have this notion of a single source of truth of data. And so if you have basically, it's called a state kind of data store, where all your data lives. And so right now, this data that we defined here kind of lives just in this application kind of definition here. But if you're doing a much bigger application where you have multiple pages, and then each one of those components or pages would look at the same data, you wouldn't want to have to repeat it for each one of these, right? And so what you can do is you can define this idea of a state store, and it basically has the one piece of data where it's stored, and everything else kind of has to ask permission to update it, and then that propagates out to all the other components and pages that use that piece of data to update it. So you kind of have this one source of truth, and then just update that state, and it changes everywhere in your application. So it's a really powerful kind of idea, and also kind of gets a little bit more complicated to that. But what's nice about Vue, at least, is that you can kind of use it in the same way that you might use jQuery or something else, right? So there's nothing stopping me from having multiple apps here, right, and defining different places. And so it's a great way to get started with this idea of reactive frameworks, is by using Vue just to drop in places where you might use jQuery or vanilla JavaScript in previous ways. So it's very easy to kind of get started with, and just kind of add this functionality in different pieces around the page, and just have many different kind of components to get things working to get started with. And then once you get kind of comfortable with that, you can advance to thinking more about the application as a holistic kind of thing, and building more on top of that. But that's it for now. I think this is a good kind of starting point to play around with reactive stuff if you want to, by getting into Vue.js and doing these kind of little smaller components and stuff like that. So thanks for watching, and I will talk to you later. Bye.